You can be seated. I have to confess to you that I chose that song without looking at the way that it's arranged in the hymnal, and I was expecting. Does that use a melody that's different in our old? I think it does, doesn't it? It's similar to the doxology, right? So sorry about that. If you were looking at that expecting it to sound a certain way, and it didn't, you can blame me for that. And nevertheless, you did great. It sounded good, and I know the Lord was pleased. So go ahead and get at your Bible if you have one to Genesis 39, verse 19. Genesis 39, verse 19. As we continue our study through the book of Genesis. Last week, we introduced Joseph's story by anchoring it in the Bible's bigger picture. Really kind of what is going on throughout the biblical narrative is that there was promised to Eve a seed who was going to crush the head of the serpent, and that promise is reiterated to Abraham, it's reiterated to Jacob, and eventually it's reiterated to Judah, so that the idea here is that this is what the story is telling, how God is going to redeem his creation. And so we saw last week that the structure of these immediate chapters in Genesis is such that you get the clear picture, and this might have been a new idea to you, that Joseph's story is a true parable of what God is going to do to save the world through Judah's lineage. And so the idea here is that Judah's the chosen one of Jacob's brothers, and God is saying, by telling us Joseph's story, here's what it's going to look like when I save the world through Judah's line, so that you may believe, so that you may look at Jesus in the New Testament and see all these parallels between him and what happened before and say, wow, look at the unity and look at how incredibly consistent God is in his redeeming character. Well, today we look a little more closely at what happens to Joseph, noting, as we'll see here, that whereas pride sometimes leads to a fall, it's often the case that in Joseph's story, like in Christ's later and then like in ours, because Jesus lives in us too, that humility sometimes leads to a fall as well, and we have to trust the Lord to bring good for us in the end. So Genesis 39, I'm going to read verses 19 to 23, and then we'll talk about it. Excuse me. So it was when Joseph's master, Potiphar is his name, heard the words which his wife spoke to him, saying, your servant did to me after this manner, his anger was aroused. And Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were confined. And he was there in the prison, but the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy, and he gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever they did there, it was his doing. The keeper of the prison didn't look into anything that was under Joseph's authority because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made it prosper. It's a word of the Lord for us today, and we're glad. Again, this is all pointing forward, and I think once you understand that, there really are kind of three contexts that we can understand the text coming to us in. And these are not the 3 points to the sermon today. I'll get to that. But it tells us what happened. As we read the story, it's telling us what happened. It's also telling us what is going to happen in Jesus' redemption on our behalf. And then thirdly, it's telling us what we can expect in our lives as we walk with Jesus and follow him. And so in particular, I want to turn back with you just to lead up to here. I want to turn back to chapter 37 of Genesis. And so go ahead and turn back there to chapter 37. Or you can just listen as I follow along. I'm not going to be reading a lot of verses, just kind of giving you a kind of a big picture of what happened. So in chapter 37, we find that Joseph is Jacob's beloved son. He loves all of his sons, but he loves Joseph more because Joseph is his favorite wife's son, and so he loves him more. And so the other brothers, it seems like they resent him. They don't like him too much, which is understandable. It just comes with the territory of being brothers, that brothers tend to not like each other when they're kids. But then when one of them is sort of proud and arrogant and is the favorite son, it's even more so the case. So he has two dreams. And one dream is an illustration that his brothers are going to bow down before him. He talks about that in verse 7. They don't like that too much, to hear about this dream where they're going to be bowing down to Joseph. And then there's a second dream in verse 9 where the whole creation is going to bow down before Joseph. Well, they don't like this either. Neither does Jacob, their dad. The brothers are getting tired of hearing about all these dreams Joseph is having, and Jacob, his dad, is as well. Even though verse 11 suggests in Genesis 37 there that his father, keeping the matter in mind, might have believed what Joseph was saying, in fact. But eventually they decide that they're going to kill their brother. And they're echoing Cain here earlier on in Genesis, aren't they? They're showing that they are not the promised seed because they have a lot more similarities to Cain than they do to the godly Abel. And so they're going to throw him in a pit. They're going to kill him and throw him in a pit. And they say, we'll see what becomes of his dreams there in verse 20 of that chapter. That sets up the rest of the story because we find out what actually did happen because of his dreams. Well, Judah in verse 28 stands up for him and says, let's sell him into slavery instead. Let's not kill him. Let's just sell him into slavery, showing some distinction between him and the rest of the brothers. That's what happens. They give him to the Midianites, and he ends up working for Potiphar, who is an officer for Pharaoh. And I'm always just a little bit, every now and then I'll see some names or some labels, some titles in the scriptures, and I'll wonder why it is that maybe I've never heard that come back as like a name or something. I just heard of a baby who was born this past week who was named Abraham, and that's wonderful. I just think Abraham's such a cool name. Solomon will eventually come back as well. You don't hear a whole lot of Potiphars being born, and I don't think that you're going to anytime soon. But there's a question that I would have for you. Should he have told his brothers and his dad about his dreams? Should he have told them about these dreams? You might say, well, in hindsight, it seems like probably he shouldn't have, because look at what they did to him. But I just would say that maybe there's another reason why he shouldn't have. Later on in Ecclesiastes 5, it says, with many words and with many dreams comes vanity. When people speak about their dreams, sin comes along with it, because usually their dreams that they're sharing with people are dreams where they are themselves lifted high, where they are themselves glorified and magnified. Later on in Deuteronomy 13, false prophets are distinguished by their dreams that they then are bringing to the people and saying these are the very words of God. So we've got to be careful with the things that we want, the things that we desire, the visions that we're seeing of our own grandeur. God would say, you know what? Just keep it to yourself. Even if it's true, just keep it to yourself. Other people don't need to hear about this. And whereas we live in a day today that says express yourself, live out your dreams, and tell people about them, God would say, slow down just a little bit and take Joseph's story perhaps as an example of why you should. And Joseph even got his dreams from God himself. God was showing him what was going to happen. Nevertheless, you see what it did to him. And this is the first point that I want to show you today. Pride goes before a fall. Pride goes before a fall. That's directly Proverbs 16:18. Pride goes before a fall. If you are lifting yourself up, if you're exalting yourself, you're getting yourself ready for a fall. If you've got a view of the world where essentially you're the king or queen and everybody's got to go your way or else you're not going to be happy, if this is how you're known at work, if this is how you're known among your family, if this is how you're known among your church, there's going to be a fall at some point. Pride goes before a fall, contrasting with Proverbs 3:34 that says that God gives grace to the humble. So, but before I don't want to turn away from this too fast because there's another side to this. We're going to see it in chapter 39. We skip over chapter 38 because we looked at it last week and we saw that that is meant to be read, being a story, the story of Judah, meant to be read as an indication that Joseph's story is actually the story of what God will do through Judah, as the end of Genesis makes very clear. It's sort of like a movie. Those of you who are movie fans, where you're not really sure what's going on throughout the story, then you get to the end and there's a big explanation, and now it just all makes sense. And it's not that it's a twist as much as it is that there were things hidden all along that you just maybe didn't realize. Now it makes sense, and now you love the movie even more. That's kind of what happens through Genesis. Why do we have this random little parentheses about Judah in chapter 38 when the story started with Joseph in 37, then gets back to him in 39? It's because Joseph's story is a parable of what God's going to do through Judah. A true parable, but nevertheless a parable. In chapter 39, we find that as Joseph is in Potiphar's custody as one of his slaves, we find that God's blessing is upon him, even as he lives the life of a slave. Serving Potiphar, it says, even in his house. Verse 4, he made him overseer of his house. That means that he is high up to Potiphar, this great figure there in Egypt. And it repeats over and over again that God is with him, and that really everything that Joseph touches seems to turn to gold. Potiphar's got him in charge of everything. He didn't worry about anything. The reason why I draw your attention to this is because I think it challenges our tendency, our tendency to assume after hearing that God is with you, that if some kind of pain or some kind of darkness or some kind of hurt comes, we immediately respond by saying, well, that was a crock to say that God was with me, because look at what has happened to me. And to assume that he must not be with me. He's forgotten about me, so I'm going to forget about him. Joseph falls hard, doesn't he? He's almost murdered by his brothers, then he's sold into slavery, and he ends up working as a slave, and yet over and over again in these first 6 verses of chapter 39, God is with him, God is with him, God is with him. Isn't that incredible? God, how could you be with this man letting all of this happen to him? And God would respond the same way that he responds to Job. Well, I'm God and you're not. Maybe I've got better purposes than you have. He is with him. You can be blessed and be in a low place at the same time. Blessed are the poor in spirit, Jesus says. Theirs is the kingdom of heaven. We wouldn't think that that's the case, but indeed it is. Well, continuing on there in chapter 39, verses 6 to 10, Potiphar's wife, as you can imagine through Genesis, based on like all the other people in this in the story, Potiphar's wife is insane, and she's quite a gem there in Egypt. But it tells us that Joseph is handsome, and quite frankly, Potiphar's wife wants him. And so she comes after him over and over again. There it says in verse 10, she spoke to Joseph day by day. She keeps coming after him over and over again, but Joseph tells her in verse 9 that if I were to do this, if we were to have a relationship, you're my master's wife. Notice he doesn't say that it would be a sin against Potiphar. He says, how then could I do this great wickedness in verse 9 and sin against God? It would be a sin against God for me to do this. Miss Potiphar, we'll call her that. Joseph knows that he is where he is because God has orchestrated all of this. You almost wonder if Joseph is beginning to see God's hand in his life. Oh, maybe, I was sold into slavery, but now I'm working for this high-up official, and now I'm high up with him. God must be doing something in me here. I would sin against him if I were to do this. Ultimately, this is what sin is. It's taking what God has graciously given and saying, it's not enough, God. I need something more. I want something more. And very quickly, it leads to a downward spiral, doesn't it? Some of us have seen it in other people. Some of us have seen it in ourselves. Note that verse 10 says, he did not heed her to lie with her or to be with her. It seems like he wouldn't even be in the same room as her. He was operating according to what's been called the Billy Graham rule, right? He wouldn't even be in the same room alone with this woman. And that's thought of as a prudish thing, and yet here it seems like a pretty wise thing on Joseph's part, because this woman's insane. It's probably the case that she's got a very frustrating, maybe lonely life. Potiphar works long hours. Maybe he's a very disciplined man. Maybe they don't have a whole lot of intimacy. I don't know. Maybe I'm reading into the text here. But she seems to be a woman who is out for something that she doesn't have. And it doesn't matter what her motives are, it's still the enemy's attempt to off the people of God like he always does. And so one day, verses 11 to 18 there, it tells us that nobody else is working in there. It's just Joseph working, and Potiphar's wife is there. And she tries seizing him, grabbing him, and forcing him into this. This is an attempted rape that's happening here. But he runs away, and she's got a hold of his garment, and he runs away, and his garment stays in her hand, and then she uses that to frame him as having tried to rape her. And I just want to point out that the insanity of the previous chapters in Genesis is continuing, isn't it? I mean, we just see this kind of thing coming up over and over and over again. And yet this time, it's the godly who suffer. Because I just would point out to you, it seems like finally we have a man of integrity in Joseph. Yeah, he was stupid when he was a kid, telling his brothers about his dreams. But when you compare him to everybody who came before him, Joseph's a good guy, isn't he? You look at Jacob, he was a swindler. Isaac put his wife in harm's way. Abraham did the same thing. Judah's crazy in the previous chapter. All the brothers tried to kill Joseph. And then Joseph is here just patiently waiting on God's timing and God's provision. And yet look at what happens to him. Look at where it gets him. He's the one as a man of integrity for once, and yet he's the one who's treated this way. Maybe the people of God should take that as an indication that if we're going to walk with him, that we're going to experience the same things. So, as we read earlier in verses 19 to 20, Potiphar hears about this and he throws Joseph in prison. I just want to point out, Potiphar didn't kill him. And I expected that Potiphar would have killed him in any other situation. But indeed he doesn't. Throws him in prison, and I think the reason is because of what verses 21 to 23 tell us. It's that the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. I think that we could probably extrapolate that and say that he gave him favor in the eyes of Potiphar as well. We don't have any indication here that Joseph is going to come back out of there after 2 years in prison to work for Potiphar again. It doesn't tell us that. You just wonder if God put some kind of favor for Joseph in Potiphar's eyes, just like he did to the keeper of the prison, just like he did for Daniel later on in Daniel 1 when you have the King Nebuchadnezzar's servants. It says that that God gave Daniel favor in his eyes. God can do this. As much as we might want to talk about how God is out there and we are down here and there's only so much he can do among us, you've heard me quote it many times, Proverbs 21:1. The king's heart is a stream in the hand of the Lord. He turns it wherever he will. It's not that he's out there and we're down here. It's that we're here, supported, sustained, kept, given life by God all the time. And he can do what he wants with what's his. You remember earlier when Abraham gave his wife Sarah basically to Abimelech, the king, one of the kings there, and Abimelech doesn't have his way with her, and then when God comes to him and he says, basically, you're a dead man because you've got another man's wife, the king says, but God, I didn't do anything. This wasn't my fault, and I didn't do anything with her. You remember what God says? Yeah, you're right, you didn't, because I'm the one who kept you from doing anything. He has the ability to do this only because it's only possible if he's sovereign. He can make his people favorites in people's eyes so that they will be treated well and fairly. What a comfort that's supposed to be for the people of God. This is what he did then. It's what he's doing now. He is in control and you are his beloved. That should be comforting, encouraging. It should be empowering to know that this is how he delights in you. And it's by all of this that Joseph is eventually going to be working for Pharaoh. Just as we know the story in with hindsight, with 2020 vision right now, we realize that it's only because Joseph is in prison here that he's going to eventually end up working for the highest office in the land, Pharaoh. He sees God's hand, doubtless, and so he's patient and he's waiting. But here, I don't want to get ahead of myself here. What I want you to see here is that secondly, humility sometimes goes before a fall. Yeah, pride goes before a fall, but humility, godliness sometimes goes before a fall. You say, what about what the scripture says about how if I fear God and if I keep his commands, it'll be well with me? What about where it says that if I acknowledge the Lord and if I fear him, he'll make my way straight. He'll make my path straight. It'll be healing to my bones. How do we square such a thing like this with his promise that he will take care of me and bless me if I go his way? Again, I'll just draw your attention to verse 20 and 21 that are back to back. Joseph was put into prison, and he was there in the prison, but the Lord was with Joseph. Again, as I said earlier, our tendency is to say God is only with me if certain outcomes come about. God is only with me if things happen the way that I think that they should. But Joseph is learning here, and it seems like maybe even he has learned and he will continue to learn that God is with people as they suffer, as they go through hardship, as they go through turmoil. He's not with people unless they go through hardship and suffering. He's with people as they go through it. And he shepherds them through it so that they will learn patience. Is this not exactly what Paul says in Romans 5? If there's testing going on via suffering, we rejoice because suffering produces what? Endurance. Endurance produces character, and character produces hope. It's because we go through things, we realize God's presence with us in the things that we learn and that we understand, if the Lord takes me through anything moving forward here in my life, his presence isn't going to forsake me because it didn't forsake me back then. And this is how he works all the time. New Testament elsewhere in Hebrews 11, it says that Joseph experienced all of this by faith. Multiple times it brings up Joseph, once explicitly in Hebrews 11:22, and then I think it implies him in 11:36 when it talks about those who were in chains, and they were in chains by faith. It says by faith, by faith, by faith. People like him, it says in Hebrews that the world was not worthy of them. And yet here he was. And I just want you to, if I could say anything about this, it would be this. He doesn't harden in his hardship, but his heart softens in the hardship. For God's people, hardship softens their hearts. It doesn't harden their hearts. We might initially get angry and have those why God prayers that we have all prayed at some point. But over time, we learn he's good, I'm not. He cares about me. He loves me. I've not loved him as I ought. What do you want to teach me in this, Lord? What do I need to grow in? And that's how the heart just goes from being hard and rigid to being soft, moldable in God's hand. I just think the best thing that God can do for us is take us into a position where he is our only hope, so that we will rely on him truly, with no outs, as it were, with no inhibitions or equivocations or sort of backdoor ways of escaping, but to truly rely on him because he is the only hope that we have. Best thing he can do is to take us into those positions. Not only do we truly rely on him, but we learn that he delivers us in his time, and we find ourselves believing in him more. Our faith has grown. So why is it that we can say that both pride and humility go before falls? Or in other words, why is it that God chooses to work through pride leading to a fall and humility leading to a fall? Because it seems like it's unfair, let's be honest. It seems like it's the proud who should be brought down, and it seems like the humble who should be elevated. So why does God choose to work through both? If we see this with Joseph, it must be the case that we see it later on, we see it with Jesus, we see it in our lives too. Why does he do this? First, if it's pride, if we are a proud people, and I mean pride in the Christian sense of I mean it negatively. Pride sometimes today is thought of as a positive thing, but it's actually a negative thing. What we mean is the elevation of ourselves, our strength, our will, our rights. Notice what's in common with all those things: my. That's what drives pride. Eventually, it's going to come down. It's going to be brought low sooner or later because it's based on a lie. Nothing that you have is actually anything that you have yourself that you gave to yourself. Everything that we have, we receive from the Lord. And it is utter foolishness to think that we deserve any credit for anything good. It all comes from him in the beginning. This is what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 4:7. He's writing to that church in Corinth. And he says, "What do you have that you did not receive?" It's a rhetorical question because it's a letter. They can't respond to him. What do you have that you did not receive? Nothing, he means. Everything that you have in your life, you received from God. And by the way, according to the New Testament, this includes faith. People only believe because the Lord brings them along and convinces them by his Spirit. Nothing good originates with us. It originates with God. Why do we love him? Why do we love others? Because love is what? From God. It's from him. Augustine knew this. Aquinas knew this. Anselm, we could go on and on and on. Most importantly, the apostles knew this. The prophets knew this. Joseph, I think, is learning this through this whole process. This is a mercy. It's a discipline, a godly discipline, so that Joseph will learn that God is his source and God is his life. And he is learning this. So if it's pride that's going to lead us to a fall, it's because God is wanting to teach us, it's pride. You need to be transformed by the renewing of your mind. But if it's, on the other hand, humility or godliness that leads to a fall, like it was later there when Joseph was trying to have integrity and he was thrown in prison, framed, wrongfully accused, all of that. If it's humility or godliness that leads to you having a fall, if you're standing up for what's right and you end up losing a job or losing a relationship or being mistreated or thrown out of some organization or something, it must be that God is lowering you so that he can raise you up in due time. It must be that there's something else that he has for you, and the only way that you're going to get to it is if he brings you low. There's one writer who refers to this as the J curve, and it's a little kind of play on the fact that Jesus' name in English starts with J, and it's the idea that just like with the letter J, you start off here and then you go lower than you are, you're going to go higher than you were before. It's the great pattern of godliness that all throughout redemptive history, everybody in Scripture, it's relentlessly trustworthy. It happens this way with everybody, with Joseph, with Israel and Egypt, with Daniel, we could go on and on. David himself. It's perfectly seen in Jesus, isn't it? Lower yourself lower than you are, and God will raise you up higher than you can imagine. Defend yourself, and God will lower you because all you have is your own defense. Let him defend you, you'll triumph because he's the one before whom we all stand and before whom we all live. I remember hearing several years ago, I was hearing Chris Rock, the great comedian Chris Rock, who's known famously recently for a famous slap on television. Maybe you know what I'm talking about. But he was talking about his great scholarly opinion about the thing that all religions have in common. He said, you know what I found out? I'm not going to do my Chris Rock impression. But he said, you know what I found out? I found out studying all the world religions that they all have one thing in common. They all say that we're supposed to be humble. We're supposed to practice humility. And I listened to that, and initially, my thought was, this guy's a comedian. He doesn't know what he's talking about with religions. Then as I thought about it a little bit more, I thought, actually, that's true. All the religions do say that we're supposed to be humble. I think because we know we're supposed to be humble and we find it to be such a challenge, like we're proud people, we know that we should be humble, so the feeling of religion comes via actually humbling ourselves and lowering ourselves. But do you know what's unique about Christianity, about the Christian gospel? It's that only here does God himself humble himself. Only here does the one who doesn't have to humble himself actually do so. By going to the cross and taking our sin on himself, lowering himself to the point of death, even death on a cross, and then he's exalted because of the work that he's accomplished. And I would say this, if we could summarize all the religions into this one similarity, it would be that. Number one, be humble. They all say that. Here's the thing, though. All the rest of them stop there. The Christian gospel comes along with 3 more points. It says, number 2, you can't. Number 1, be humble. Number 2, you can't do it, can you? Because the minute you start to be happy about your humility, what happens? You start to become proud. You can't do this. Thirdly, Jesus did it. He humbled himself. And fourthly, he will give it to you if you trust in him. The reason I'm a Christian is because that is revealed, that is not made up by humanity. It's the truth. Because for him, humility did lead to a fall. But his fall led to a greater resurrection, which leads me to my third and final point here, and it's this. The godly will sometimes endure long trials for the sake of good in the end. Just want you to notice, just kind of big picture here. He's sold into slavery in chapter 37. And then in 38, Judah has a family and he has boys, and they apparently grow up and become teenagers, and they're going to marry. One of them is going to die, and then the second one is going to die. Meanwhile, Joseph rises to success in chapter 39. So what are we looking at here? Maybe 20 years? 20 years as a slave of Potiphar, perhaps? That would mean that probably he's a teenager when all that happens earlier, when he's sold into slavery. That would explain why it is that Potiphar's wife thinks that he's so handsome, because he's in his mid-30s, and we all just know that men in their mid-30s are just incredibly handsome. So she comes after him after this long, long trial. He's thrown in prison. He rises over time. It's probably going to be more years, as we're going to talk about it next week. He's going to receive this dream interpretation gift that's going to eventually end him up working for Pharaoh. This is a long, long time. Decades. You know what? Just like Jacob, actually, wasn't it? Because Jacob had to go find a wife, and he had to work for 14 years before he got the one that he wanted. And it's insane what happened there, how he ends up with these 2 wives and he's got 1 million kids. And it's like, Lord, I already had my 14-year trial of trying to get the wife that I wanted. Now you've given me 1 million kids, and now I'm never going to sleep again. But then guess what happens? When he meets back up with Esau, Esau looks at all of the family that Jacob has, and what does Esau do? He loves what he sees. Oh, look at how God has blessed you, Esau says. It's only because God gave him all of that through that long trial. Similarly, Paul, later on in the book of Acts, at the end of Acts, when he's in that great storm at sea, he's on his way to Italy because he's going to stand trial and all of that. That storm occurs, and it's an entire season. It's probably 2 seasons, actually. It's probably 6 months, maybe even up to there, that he's, whether he's on the water in the ship, or he's on the island, or he's drifting almost all the way to Africa. But it's because of his leadership, his integrity, and his trustworthiness that the Roman official who's watching over him ends up vouching for him. He gets to Rome, and he gets a house arrest in an apartment instead of having to be put in the stocks in jail. An apartment of his own cost. He could pay rent himself. And people can come to him, and he can preach the gospel to them. It's only because of the long trial that he endured. And just like Jacob gets this big family that ends up warming Esau's heart to him because of the long trial, just like Paul, because of the long trial, gets a gospel ministry in Rome. So similarly here to Joseph, for Joseph, this long trial is going to get him to Pharaoh one day, where he's going to be a blessing to Israel and the nations. Note just God is with him there, and instead of the hardship hardening him, it's softening him. This is a long obedience, as one writer said, in the same direction. In time, resurrection will occur. But how do we know for sure that long trial leads inevitably to resurrection? The ultimate answer is because of what happened to Jesus himself. He's not only the antitypical pattern of Joseph, but he's also the pattern of our lives as well. He establishes for us what we can expect. And let me geek out here for just a couple of minutes for you, and I trust that you'll be patient with me because you always are. When it says in chapter 37, verse 3, let me backtrack. The Old Testament's written in Hebrew, New Testament's written in Greek. There is an Old Testament version in Greek that is called the Septuagint. That was the Old Testament version that the writers of the New Testament had. And I just want to point out that the word in verse 3, the phrase of chapter 37, verse 3, when it says that Israel loved Joseph more than all of his children because he was the son of his old age, is almost the exact same phrase that's used in the gospel accounts when it says that the Father says, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I'm well pleased." It's also the case that in verse 19 of chapter 37, when they say, "This dreamer is coming," verse 20, "Come therefore, let us kill him." Do you remember when Jesus told the parable of the tenants in the vineyard? And there's a master who sends his son, his beloved son, who to get from them what they've made there in the vineyard. And it says that when they saw him, you remember what they said? They said, "Come, let us kill him." Exact same Greek phrase as in verse 20 there. Let us kill him. Furthermore, later on, you don't have to turn there. In Genesis 41:38, it says that that Joseph is a man in whom is the Spirit of God. He is the only man in the book of Genesis who, it says, has the Spirit of God. I guess my point is this. When you read Joseph's story, you are reading Jesus' story. He's the truly beloved Son. He's the one in whom is the Spirit of God. He's the one whom his brothers killed and wanted to kill because they were jealous of him, and yet he is the one who God raised up. He's the one who, though he didn't have any pride, they took it as pride and therefore they killed him. His fall was for everybody else's pride. And his humility led to his fall, but God the Father raised him up in the end. This is why he could say, "Moses wrote about me." Because when Moses wrote Joseph's story, he was telling Jesus's. And just like Joseph was made perfect in one sense through this story, through his suffering, maybe not actually perfect in every sense. Just look at kind of the revenge that he has on his brothers later on as they come into Egypt. We'll get to that. But he was made perfect through his suffering, so Jesus was truly, as Hebrews 5 says, made perfect through his suffering. And therefore, if you trust in him, if you believe in him, if you follow him and take up the cross and have him be your life, you are going to be made perfect through your suffering as well. All suffering, all pain for the Christian becomes simply a means of growth in grace. It's never pointless. It's never purposeless. It's never simply the aspects of the fall happening in my life. It is always in the hand of the Lord who cares about you and will make you like his Son. Don't be surprised by falls in this life. Don't be surprised. It not only happens because of pride, it happens because of humility and godliness as well, but God will not forsake the work of his hands. You never know what God's doing, do you? We never know what he's doing. But we know that whatever he's doing is going to be for our good in the end. Maybe it's pride that's driven you to a fall, but he's got to lower you to raise you, and he's going to. Maybe you've got humility and godliness, and that's led to a fall. And maybe he's just simply preparing you for something greater and something better in the end. Maintain, like Joseph, faithfulness, trustworthiness, integrity. It won't always be received well in the world, just like Potiphar's wife was enraged by Joseph's rejection. But in time, God is going to bless it. And just like Joseph learned, I think over time, that his righteousness was God's, his self. Again, saying, I can't do this because it'd be a sin against God. Going God's way, I've got to do that because it's God in me. And it's only a matter of time before he vindicates what belongs to him. So it's going to be the same thing with you. If you cling to the Lord in your hour of darkness and in your deeper trial, if you cling to him in that time, he is going to raise you up in due time. The question is not, how do you feel about your life? How do you feel about the chapter that you're in right now? The question is always, do you belong to him? Are you the work of his hands? Because if that's the case, it doesn't matter what's going on around you. You belong to him, and he will not forsake the work of his hands. So let's pray. Our Father and our God, today we thank you for the great pattern of your Son that we see as we read these great stories, Abraham, Jacob, Joseph, Judah. Everywhere we find shadows of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, who is himself our salvation, that we would believe in, trust in him, and understand that his life is in us. We are a new creation in him. May we live like it, O Lord. Help us to cling to you, grant us to trust in you, and to walk this pilgrim journey, understanding that whatever prison we might be in, whatever enslavement, proverbially understood, we might be in, if it is Friday or Saturday, Sunday is coming, and the Lord will not forsake the work of his hands, but raise us up in due time. All we have to do is look at Jesus and understand that it happened with him, and if he's living in us, it's going to happen with us too. Let it be the case, O Lord, that there's not a single soul here that is not in fellowship with the risen Christ. May they all know you.